Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I hope everyone had a great Canada Day weekend, and thank you once again for tuning in. Now, speaking of Canada Day, traditionally, Canada Day has been an occasion to celebrate this country's many accomplishments and the pride that Canadians take in their country. In recent years, however, our liberal and progressive elites want to make Canada Day more an occasion for self-loathing. They want us to focus on everything that's bad in Canada's history and ignore all the good that we should be celebrating. If you think I'm exaggerating, consider what NDP leader Jagmeet Singh tweeted on Canada Day. Today, on Canada Day, we have much to reflect on. We must continue to acknowledge the history of colonialism and its lasting impacts on Indigenous peoples, while moving to right the wrongs of the past and work towards justice together. Notice that Singh nowhere says we should celebrate Canada Day, but rather we're supposed to spend the day reflecting on everything that he considers bad in Canadian history, going back to the arrival of European settlers and the plight of Indigenous Canadians. While there's no doubt that Indigenous Canadians have suffered, and in many cases continue to suffer today, we have to ask ourselves whether Canadians today have to carry this perpetual cross for the sins of their ancestors in the event that they're of European descent. And how does this apply to new Canadians, many of whom are Indigenous to the places they came from and have themselves been victims of colonization? In other words, when are we allowed to stop considering ourselves visitors and consider this to be our native land? If you and your family have been here for 400 plus years, obviously this is your native land. Or if you came as a new immigrant, for your kids, this will be their native land. Asserting that simple fact in no way takes away from the reality that the ancestors of Indigenous Canadians came to this continent before anyone else, so far as we know. Let's not forget that when Indigenous people arrived here a millennia ago, they too were settlers in a new land when they crossed the ice from Eurasia to the Americas. In other words, if you take a strict definition of who is Indigenous, really the only people on the planet that would qualify are people from Africa, where human life is said to have begun. The rest of the planet was populated in waves of migration that took place over thousands of years. Now, as part of those waves of migration, European settlers, mainly the British and the French, arrived in what is today known as Canada. That's a fact of history, along with every other migration that has taken place throughout human history. It's absurd and really unfair and ridiculous that the descendants of those European settlers so many generations later should be made to feel ashamed, like they're second-class citizens, for something they themselves have no responsibility for. Likewise, newcomers to Canada, and that included me a quarter century ago, came to this country looking for new opportunities and a new life, which includes, believe it or not, tapping into a positive sense of Canadian identity. Just imagine how perplexing it must be when new Canadians, when they arrive here, face a barrage of self-loathing from our political and cultural elites. Rather than a positive set of values that they can latch onto, they're being fed this narrative that Canada is fundamentally racist, it's bigoted, it's evil, while ironically, many new Canadians came here to flee bigotry and oppression in their home countries. There's something to be learned from our neighbors to the south. I happen to be recording this on the 4th of July, which is Independence Day for the US. And what's noteworthy is that on this particular day, Americans across the political spectrum come together to celebrate what is great about America. And at least for that day, as far as I can tell, by and large, they seem to be able to put aside their political and ideological bickerings. And they certainly don't seem to turn this into a day of self-flagellation. By contrast, here in Canada, under Trudeau's Canada, the significance of Canada Day and the symbols that have made this country so great have successfully been whittled down. Let's not forget that time 2 years ago when Trudeau lowered the national flag for months on end, ostensibly to atone for a highly contested claim that the bodies of Indigenous children were found at the site of a former residential school in Western Canada. 2 years later, no actual bodies have been found. Yet, to even assert that simple fact is seen as taboo by our political elites. It's not just that our political and cultural elites are misguided when they keep sounding the drumbeat of past injustices to Indigenous people. I suspect there's something sneakier going on here. They would like to shift our gaze backward to historical injustices, which cannot be undone today since we haven't invented time travel. It clearly is intended to shift the focus away from the situation of Indigenous people today. The data show that they consistently lag behind other Canadians, both old stock and new immigrants, on every possible social indicator, whether it's income, employment, health, or education. The real challenge is for governments to work toward better integrating Indigenous people into mainstream Canadian society, rather than lamenting on what went wrong in the past. That's really a form of tokenism, much like the token land acknowledgements that everyone is now supposed to make. Just think about how ridiculous the land acknowledgements really are. On the one hand, we're told to say that this is really Aboriginal land, and then some institution or the other will claim that they're custodians of the land for the Aboriginal people. Really? So we're custodians of your land, but we get to decide what to do with it, right? Just think about how incredibly patronizing, dehumanizing, and even racist this sounds, that it really is turning Indigenous people into an object of pity and depriving them of any agency to improve their lives today. It has to be the worst form of hypocritical tokenism that the left excels in. Now, the bottom line for me is that rather than being in this constant state of recriminations and self-loathing coming out of ills of the past, it's time for all Canadians, and that includes Indigenous Canadians and Canadians of European descent and everyone else, to take pride in this country's considerable achievements and all of the progress that it's made over the decades, and celebrate what's positive about Canada as we look ahead, not backward. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.